50 Million Frenchmen Can Be Wrong, or Why Norwegians Hate the Swedes, by Kurt Ringquist. Regional distaste is a well-known anthropological term I just made up, but I think it is apt, not to mention apropos, fitting, and otherwise on the money. There is something about people who live in one country that makes them have nothing but bad things to say about the people who live in the adjoining countries. And people who live in one state are constantly ripping the denizens of the state next door. One town makes fun of the next, your block hates my block, and the people who live downstairs are morons. This seems to be inescapable. Not that I've actively tried to escape it, you understand. It just seems that way, and that was good enough for my grandmother, so it's good enough for me. You got anything bad to say about my grandmother, huh? Well, do you, punk? I thought not. At their very worst, these are stereotypes that make everybody feel bad. We'll bypass those. It makes us all uncomfortable, and I want you all cozy and warm, your feet in your footed jammies and your hands wrapped around a hot toddy, unless it's summer, in which case I want you by the pool with a frozen daiquiri. Are you comfy? Good. Now down to business in a way I hope will only offend those people who aren't reading this, and really, who cares about those people anyway? Norwegians do not like Swedes, and vice versa. I know this because my grandparents were Swedish, and they would come out with these derogatory comments about Norwegians every now and again, and it always blew my mind. I can guarantee you that nobody outside of a Scandinavian can possibly tell the difference between a Swede and a Norwegian. I mean, what, do they spell Sven differently or something? There is a little anti-Swede rhyme that my grandfather would quote as proof of what jerks Norwegians are. Referring to some ancient battle, yes, Swedes and Norwegians used to kill each other with reckless abandon, the rhyme went, "A thousand Swedes ran through the weeds, chased by one Norwegian." Now, of course, this is an affront to Swedish manhood and must be avenged somehow, possibly by creating a creamier sauce to pour over stinky fish. 400 years ago, Sweden was quite the military power. Talk about blowing one's mind. Again, I think smelly fish was somehow involved. And Norway was, for a long time, basically a vassal state, and it's caused bad blood ever since. Another funny Scandinavian-type thing is that the Swedes and the Norwegians, and probably the Finns for all I know, consider the Dutch to be the world's great cheapskates. Outside Northern Europe, you just know that nobody cares, but it seems to be a big deal to them. I just happen to know about this little rivalry or prejudice or irrational hatred because my family is Swedish. If my family were from Spain, I'm sure I would grow up hearing what rats these Portuguese are, and if they were Thai, I'd get an earful about what notorious tightwads those darn Burmese can be. But inside this country, that's the United States of America for those keeping score, I've seen the regional distaste phenomenon everywhere I've lived. I grew up in Connecticut. Ask any Connecticut-type person, I believe we are called nutmeggers, but that sounds so dumb, who the worst drivers in the world are. Answer, New York drivers, every time. The only other drivers who could possibly be as bad are New Jersey or Massachusetts drivers. I know many nutmeggers, see, I gave in to the peer pressure, who think the worst thing Connecticut ever did was take down the toll booths because paying that quarter kept the New York riffraff out. New Yorkers are considered rude, pushy, and obnoxious. To be fair, New Yorkers actually consider themselves to be rude, pushy, and obnoxious, but they see these as positive traits. I have spoken to enough New Yorkers to know that they consider us nutmeggers to be stuck-up, boring, and generally unmanly, if you're talking about men, and very cold, if you're talking about women. They might be right about some of that. I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and therefore know that people from Ohio are the lowest form of life, particularly if they root for Ohio State. They can't drive. Nobody from an adjoining state can successfully operate an automobile. They are a bunch of uncouth hicks and do not deserve to be able to, improperly, drive their piece-of-junk vehicles to a city as wonderful as Ann Arbor. This is a city that refers to itself as the Paris of the Midwest with a straight face. I also spent a couple of years in Minnesota, and you don't want to know what they think about people from Iowa. Radar O'Reilly from MASH would be considered a sophisticated genius compared to the average Minnesotan's opinion of the average Iowan. They don't express it as directly because Minnesota is infected with this weird phenomenon called Minnesota Nice, where people smile all the time and are always bringing you Jell-O with marshmallows on top but really hate your guts. I can't explain it. I've never lived in Texas, but I visited Dallas for 2 days and got an earful about those blankety-blank Oklahomans. It's everywhere. And how about those poor excuses for humanity who live in the next town? Makes no difference what town you were in or what town they're in. They're dopes, and they can't drive. Their high school football team doesn't deserve to beat yours, and they wear those funny clothes. This is sometimes true. 25 years ago, it was all the rage for people in Darien, Connecticut, to wear polo shirts with the Darien zip code 06820 embroidered on the chest. And your neighbors make the apartment house smell funny when they cook that weird food, and they're always playing music that nobody in their right mind would like, and their kids' friends are a bunch of hooligans. See how this goes on and on down the line? I will bet cash money that the mice who live in your wall make fun of those idiot mice from the next wall over. The cockroaches under the sink can't stand the cockroaches under the stove, and the cells in your right arm know beyond any doubt that the cells in your right shoulder can't drive to save their lives. I know cells don't drive, but you get the point. And all this makes no sense when you start working it up the chain. If your neighbor belongs to the set of people who can't drive, but he lives in your town where everyone knows it's the people in the next town who can't drive, who live in your state where everyone knows it's the people from New York who really can't drive, and on, does this mean that nobody can drive? That everybody cooks food that smells funny and plays weird music and has kids who are a stain upon all upright walking vertebrates? Yes, it does. We make up these differences because it's nice to be on Team Sweden or Team Connecticut or Team Westport or Team Apartment 3D, fighting the good fight against Norway or New York or Norwalk or Apartment 4F. None of us really know how to drive worth a used stamp. But we do love the safety of the collective identity. As Pat Paulson once said, as a country we're great, as a people we're great, it's just that as individuals we stink. But we don't stink really. It's just those New York drivers.